start with a very famous battle and how they were used there to save 2,500 people. So the story is actually in a movie called A Bridge Too Far, which is the story of Operation Market Garden. The Allies had landed in June of 1944, and in September of that year, Montgomery came up with this brilliant plan to leapfrog around the German lines by taking 3 bridges and then going east into the Ruhr industrial heartland. And the other advantage is the Allies were still dragging stuff all the way from Normandy for supplies. So there were 3 bridges we'll see. This is the northernmost bridge, and it's going to be taken by airborne troops. And you may remember this scene from the movie, and staged very accurately and faithfully. And that's the bridge today, and there's a memorial to Colonel Frost, a British 1st Airborne colonel who held this bridge after being dropped in against all odds. Before we start, I think we've got the master timeline there for you to show each of the manufacturers we're talking about today and how they fit in and what decade things were invented and so forth. So this is an Evinrude overview, and at this time, Ralph Evinrude, the son, is running. He started to run it in 1934 after his dad died and his mother died. And so he got the company through the Depression and then turned his efforts to getting us through the war, basically. So the basic problem was that the Allies had landed in Normandy and all of the beaches, Omaha and so forth. And all the supplies had to come in to fight through northern France and their drive eastward to Germany, because that's all they had. They had none of the ports in the Netherlands, which is up here. Okay. And those are deep water ports. So they had all these docks and everything else out at Normandy where they're trying to get in this tremendous amount of supplies. So Montgomery came up with this idea of making a breakthrough. The red line indicates in the beginning of September of 1944 where the Allied lines were and the German lines. And his idea, Montgomery's idea, was to break through up here. Then you could go right into the Ruhrgebiet where all the steel and heavy-duty stuff is made, and you could also get these ports. The Germans were largely in retreat at the time, and it seemed opportune. Eisenhower didn't like it. He didn't want to do it. He thought that there were too many risks. The number one risk you'll see being this road. This is where the Allied lines were. There was 1 2-lane road between there and Arnhem. The idea was to drop paratroopers in Eindhoven and at Nijmegen and at Arnhem. 30,000 airborne paratroopers. It had never been done before. It's never been done since. A larger scale operation in Normandy, and they only had 7 days to plan it. So needless to say, there was a lot of trepidation on the ground that this would even work. The big problem being that 30 Corps of the British Army had to make it up this 2-lane road to relieve these paratroopers because they literally jumped only with what was on their back. They had enough food and ammunition for 2 days. They ended up being stranded up there for 5 or 6. So that was the idea. Now what happened was in Arnhem, the whole idea was to get to Arnhem, to take this bridge, which the British 1st Airborne did, and they were on the north side, but the Germans were on the south side, and hold it until this giant army came up this 2-lane road. Well, the drive stalled 1 mile from that bridge, and the paratroopers were stranded on the north side of the Rhine River, about here, 2,500 of them. So what does this have to do with Outboards? Well, this is actually a picture of the drop of 30,000 paratroopers over a 2-day period. They couldn't all get them all out at one time. And this is the routes that they fought, the red being the Germans and the blue being the British 1st Airborne. And the landing zones, which all of the military people were really upset about, were nowhere near the bridge, which is here. So they had to hoof it along the Rhine in this narrow little corridor to get there to begin with, fighting again with only the things that they had in their back. And this is how it progressed day by day. This is the 18th of September. This is the 19th to the 21st. And what happened is the Germans counterattacked, and 2,500 people were trapped in this little bulge on the Rhine River. Okay, and they were going to be massacred, or they were going to be taken captive. So what happened was, this is the little command post right about on the river where this little pocket of British First Airborne West. They tried from the other side of the river to launch reinforcements. They didn't have storm boats or any kind of mechanized boats, so if you see in the movie, you got the actors paddling with their rifle butts. They didn't even have enough paddles. And the current was 10 miles an hour, so if you started out from one side, you ended up downriver in German hands, and that's exactly what happened. So if you start at point A and you're going for point B, you're going to end up at sea, okay, because of the current. So this entire story is told in a wonderful book called The Stormboat Kings, where a little company of Canadian combat engineers, 50 people, using British design, American-made plywood boats called stormboats, and Evinrude-built motors rescued 2,500 people in one night, in the pouring rain, in the pitch black, in a hail of German machine gun fire. These are the little boats. That's 16 foot long. It's about an 18-inch freeboard, and they were made in mass quantities by little boat shops all over the country. This is the Minnetonka Boat Works in Minnesota. And you can see that the stringer system that they had under the plywood was really elaborate because these boats were designed to be beached at 25 miles an hour. So you had a motor on this thing, you go wide open with 9 guys laying in it. You had to kneel to operate the outboard motor, so the combat engineer was exposed. They'd run it up on the beach, the troops would roll out and start firing, and these combat engineers would turn the boat around again and go for a second wave, and so forth. So I've got a list of who made these. They were all small boat companies. There's the bigger companies like Chris Craft and Garwood. They were making patrol boats, PT boats, larger type vessels. So this was left to them. And here's the best possible picture you can have of the double-bottom stormboat. Now they weighed about 700 pounds, so this one's being skidded. When you actually see these things carried, it's something else. So Florida Boats Company, which is later called Craft, Century Boats in Michigan, Foster Boat Company in Michigan, and Minnetonka all made these little tiny boats. This is a blow-up of Century in the boats that they made, and they did the assault boat development that you can see there, and they also made about 300 or so of the storm boats. The boat itself was designed by the British to be used with this motor. This is called a British Seagull. Okay. These were used at Dunkirk. It's about a 2 or 3 horse motor. So the entire boat was engineered for that. And the little tiny transom was not up to taking what Evinrude needed to develop for the U.S. mission, which was to go 25 miles an hour with 9 people fully combat loaded. So what Ralph Evinrude did was take one of their racing motors, a 4-60. We have one down here in the truck room that was donated by one of the gentlemen sitting here in the audience. And it was a 4-cylinder, 2-stroke motor. And they pumped this thing up from about 30 horse to 50 because that was the requirement. But it is heavy. And the museum has a collection of these storm boats that we're going to see in a minute. That's the actual 460 that they started with. And you can see 2 of the cylinders on this side. A boxer arrangement, 2 on each side. And it was a great racing boat or motor throughout the 30s. This is the actual photograph of the technical manual, which is now in the library of the museum, along with the storm boat technical manual of how these things work. So that 460 morphed into this beast. Now this thing is about as tall as I am. It had an extra long shaft for it to work. And it has 2 cavitation plates. There's one on the lower unit. And you can always tell one of those it's a war motor, even if it's painted silver, because it has that second cavitation plate. And that had to do with the characteristics of it hanging on this little plywood boat and what it needed to be done to keep it from sucking air. This is from the actual technical training manual, which shows you some of the features. 2 massive handles here that were designed. You had to have 2 people. The thing weighs 250 pounds. And what they usually did was thread a water pipe through here. This is hollow. They put a water pipe like so, and a water pipe like so, and they get 4 guys to handle it by having run these 2 handles through it. Massive motor. They were designed to fit in this kind of plywood box. And in this box you had covers, you had spare paddles, you had a 5-gallon jerry can, you had shipments, you had everything that you needed. And I've only seen one of these for sale, and I'm still kicking myself that I didn't buy it. But at the time, groceries seemed more important than buying a story case. So here is from the actual Army training manual, and you notice I'm here carrying it with the 2 water pipes, okay? And they get it in here, but what's really interesting, as you can see, is that bracket. Why the bracket? The bracket is there because that transom was not designed to hold 250 pounds, not to mention the massive thrust of this motor on this tiny little plywood boat. So they had to put a bracket on it, and the museum's motor has that bracket. They're almost non-existent. Most of the ones after the war were, converted to the regular kind of pad and eye carrying devices. So in the museum's archives now, they have this manual. Here they are, resting it onto its tripod and mounting it on the transom. Okay. The boats themselves were designed to be carried in a conventional truck that had a tilt kind of bed. But it didn't tilt much, though they nested 4 to a truck. You would take the cover off, put it down on the ground, kind of jump on the bow, and then drive out from under it and let it fall. And that's what they did, because they didn't have time, for this kind of nicety stuff with a hydraulic lift and all that. Now the problem was when the British Army, the 2,500 paratroopers, got stuck on the north side of the Rhine, none of these boats were within 100 miles. All they had were the little canvas paddling boats. So they had to give them priority on this 2-lane road all the way up from the U.S. lines in combat all the way back up to the river to try to rescue these guys. And the story of this rescue is incredible. Driel, on this side, is where the U.S. Allies formed to save these guys who were in the pocket here. There were 30-foot-high embankments, the dikes on our side of the river and on the other side. So they had to drag these storm boats and their motors up these 30-foot-high giant banks of earth, even to get them down to the Rhine River, not to mention get them on the water, get them rigged, and not get shot to death in the process. So this is actually a close-up of some of the staging area. You can see the current is flowing from right to left. So if you started paddling a little dinghy here, okay, by the time you got to the other side, you were in the German lines. Because this pocket was only about 600 feet wide, where the British 1st Airborne were trapped. About 6 foot, 100 feet wide, and about a quarter mile deep. So these Canadian engineers hauled these storm boats over that massive dike in the cover of darkness, loaded these giant storm boat motors on these things, and carried off in the pouring rain across that river in the 10-mile current, got to the other side and started loading people and going back and forth all night. Half of them died. Half of those 50 guys died, so the 2,500. We say 2,500 lives. So there's some more pictures of storm boats, very hard to find in the archives, and you can see that's the motor in each case, this Evinrude that Ralph designed just for this process. Okay, so at the end of the day, there were 30,000 people dropped in this airborne assault, the largest one in history. 17,500 of them died. And the mission failed because they did not get the Arnhem Bridge. The British 1st Airborne took it, and then they were overrun. And as Colonel Frost, for whom the bridge is now named, fought an unbelievable battle with a very few amount of troops, and held off basically SS Panzer Division on the other side that was trying to cross this bridge. So one of the great stories of human endurance, great stories of heroism, and also folly in terms of the whole operation, making it dependent on one particular road. These are actually pretty rare. These are internal Evinrude documents at the time to motivate the employees, to keep them going for the war effort, to show them, what they're doing with the products that they make. And here's a torpedo supply motor. It's a long, tall motor that we have in a collection here to do with the Catalina flying boats. These are the bridge sections that were powered by Johnson, a little engine called the POLR 22 horse. And that's how all those floating bridges got built. And they were used on captain's gigs. I mean, they were used all over the place. So we're going to see some more applications. But the most popular, of course, in the public's imagination were these storm boats, flying across the border with this massive 50 horse and this little plywood you know, to take people to combat. And I found these on eBay, and they're really great. So this was a period advertisement. Both Johnson, Evinrude, and even Mercury would try to, you know, keep people. Remember, we're doing war stuff now, but everybody's fear was after the war, nobody would remember about outboard motors, you know, and that they would be in trouble after the war. This is a post-war version of that storm boat motor. You can tell by two ways. One is it has the fin down here. It's still got these handles on it, but it's painted silver. And they installed a civilian bracket on it. They had thousands of these things left at the end of the war. The government canceled the contract. So they converted it into a civilianized version and sold them through 1950. This is a modern storm boat motor made by Evinrude. It's designed to be launched out of a submarine underwater or dropped out of an airplane. It is completely watertight down to about 30 feet. And when these SEAL teams come up out of these submarines and they pull the cord underneath and they float up to the surface, this thing has to be ready to run. So the cowl and everything is watertight. And you can see there's a jet-powered version of it, and usually there's a duct around that to protect the propeller blades from falling. So stormboat motors haven't gone away. It's a multi-fuel thing. It'll run anything from kerosene to perfume to gasoline because they never know what they're going to find in combat. Now, what we're probably used to is when we think about crossing a river, we think about these rubber rafts. And as we've seen, they're not very practical. These boats were called assault boats, the M2 assault boat. And they were made out of plywood too, but they were more like a john boat. This was the original john boat, only it was made out of plywood. And they would take two of these and pin them together, we'll see, okay? One on either side. And what they used them for was in very low current applications, you could paddle them. And these weighed 900 pounds, so you can see the crew that it took to move these. They were moved by this Johnson PO 15. It was converted to a military use. This is the original civilian model. You can see it's a big, beefy motor for 20 horse, you know, or 22 horse. It was really big. But they were able to marinize that thing to the military requirements. So it has a big ring around it. It's got an oversized lower unit and a longer leg. And that's the technical manual for that motor. Now, how did they use it? Here you see one bolted onto the back of that M2 assault boat. This is the motor in green. This is the one that the museum has in its collections. And here it is on the end of the M2 raft being used as a barge. Here's the meat and the sandwich. You get two of these boats together. They pin on like a hinge, like a piano hinge. All right? Across those, you would put a treadway. So you could take tanks, jeeps, troops, anything across it. But how did you get this out in the river? Well, what you would do is a section like this would have that Johnson outboard motor, and you would point this section upstream and kind of get over toward the shore, okay, so that the end of this was on the shore, and they would pin it. And so you got your Johnson going upstream at 10 miles an hour just to hold it steady. Then another one of these things comes up, motors up, and connects on to the end of it, again keeping the motor running. At the end of the string, it might be 100 sections wide before you got across the Rhine River or whatever. All the 100 outboard motors are running. All of these things are being held in place upstream. Then the Corps of Engineers guys would go upstream from this raft, which is being, or this bridge, which is being held in place by the motors, drop anchors, bring the cables back, and tie them to the upstream side of these things to hold them. At the end of the day, when it's all secure, they go, turn them off. So a truck would go out on this bridge that they've just made and collect these 100 outboard motors, these little Johnson PO LR15s, and away we go to the next combat. And these things saved tons of people.
How did they refuel them?
They refueled them out of 5-gallon cans. There were no remote cans for outboard motors in those days, till 1949, as a matter of fact. So you had to get a jerry can, which is the only way they had, or 55-gallon drums with a crank and a hose. And you were doing this in the boat, you know, while the water was going around.
Loud and stinky.
Yeah, and they weren't real concerned about EPA requirements at that time. So this is probably a Studebaker truck coming off of one of those sets of ones. This is 9th Army's only after-action report of what they lost crossing the Rhine. This is just one Army's report. But you can see that they lost 31 of the Johnson 22-horse motors. They lost 18 Stormboat motors. It says 55 horse through 50. And you know, the number, they lost 46 assault boats and so forth. It was a very pricey thing. This doesn't count the number of people that were lost. But I thought when I read through each Army's summary of how they did this, that it was fascinating to give you a little window. Now, this is a lot of stuff to get to the Outboard Motors involvement, but it captured my mentality and my heart, you know, that these people saved this many people simply out of guts, a little plywood, and some, you know, plunky engines in the middle of the night. So, any questions on that? Yes, sir.
I learned water ski at the age of 13 behind that same 22-horse Johnson.
Did you really?
Yeah.
Yeah. They're really tough, and most of them run. And people in the antique outboard motor club, they still run. Okay, I didn't bother to introduce myself because you know me from the last time. So the next thing we're going to talk about is we'll go to what you probably expected to see when you came here today, which is a history of one manufacturer, which is Carl Kiekefer and Mercury. Okay, so we're going to start with, this is a picture of Carl. I'm going to start here a second. Okay, more slideshow. Carl Kiekefer was a farm boy in Wisconsin, not far from Milwaukee, and he had a German family with a name like Kiekefer. And they were great farmers. And Carl was expected to take over the family farm. He didn't want to. So his father rejected him for refusing to accept the family farm. And Carl went off to a series of night schools to learn to be an electrical engineer. So in 1939, he talked a group of his townspeople in Cedarsburg, Wisconsin, to buy an abandoned factory. And he was going to make electronic milk separators. This is a magnet, electromagnet would get middle filings and chips out of milk that was being processed. So this is the chronology of Mercury. It started in 1939 when Carl bought this building. It had nothing to do with outboards, had no interest in outboards. He's going to make milk separators. All right, he walks into the door on the night that his wife is giving birth to their first child. Somebody goes to the hospital, gives him the keys to the new factory, he says, see ya. So his wife's in labor, he leaves to go to the new factory. He walks in the door and he finds a big surprise, shall we say. The short version is, in 1940, he started making his own outboards and the Sea King brand for boards. And he stayed with them until 1967 or so when he left because his company had been acquired. But you can see the details in there, but I want to hit some of the highlights. One of the finest portraits I've ever seen of a human being is in this book. You'll think it's made up. It isn't made up. This guy's life was like a storybook. He had 250 patents. He was a genius. He was also a first-class jerk. To the people that worked for him, and he was abusive. His favorite expression was, I pay them more than they're worth, and I make them earn it. I mean, he was just a real character. And the people that worked there were under constant pressure. But you read this thing, you can't put it down literally. You could care less about outboard motors. This is a portrait of a human being that's just really unique. Okay? This is the factory that he got that snowy night when his wife was in labor. And he's very excited about it. That factory still exists, the building. Been modified, but you can still see it. Okay? And he walks in and there's 500 of these things, Thors, laying on the ground. Now what's a Thor? Thor was the guy's last name. And if you can see this, and when the outboards are hung, you will be able to see it. That's a stamped piece of mild steel. Thor was the stamping manager for General Motors. And when he left, he decided he was going to make a very inexpensive but reliable outboard motor out of stamped steel. So everything on this motor is stamped steel. The brackets, Even when you get up to the power end, everything is stamped steel except for the actual part where the piston goes up and down, okay? Designed to bolt together. Now the good news was it was cheap to make. The bad news was he made it out of mild steel. And this has just got a one coat of paint on it, so when it goes in the water, it rusted badly. If it was in salt water, it really rusted badly. And they didn't have carburetors. He went cheap with something called a mixing valve. The best way I can describe a mixing valve is your shower. Okay, that's a mixing valve. It's not a carburetor. It does not atomize the gasoline like a perfume sprayer would, and that's what a perfume sprayer is. You know, it's an atomizer, and that's what you need to really have an efficient motor. So they didn't run them all, but Thor had them in a couple of different models, one with a fancier tank, a 2-cylinder and a 3-cylinder. Okay, so in there, there are 500 of these in a crate with a note from Montgomery Ward. These don't work, we want our money back. Well, Carl didn't have any money, and neither did his investors. Every dime they had was in this building to build milk separators. So he panicked. Remember, his wife is now at the hospital, has had the baby, he hasn't seen her, hasn't been in contact with her. So he runs around to his friends, gets a carburetor, finds the magnetos for the 2-cylinder version, puts them on the 1-cylinder version because they're twice as hot, gets one to run, and he drives all night to Chicago. The next morning, he's knocking on the door of the Montgomery Ward supplier who buys motors. And he says, look, if you take these, you know, if you could take these back, I'll make sure that they all run. And the guy thought a minute and he said, I'll take them back if you promise to make me a real outboard. And Carl immediately said, sure, I'll make you a whole line. I'll make your Sea King outboards. He had no ideas about outboard motors, not a thing. But he was handy. So that's the story of how Mercury got started. This is a picture of some of the Thors, and those wooden crates are what he would have found on the floor when he walked into that factory the first time. And another really good shot, and very rare, of the Thors. And the museum now has 3 Thors, including something called a Speedliner, so it has a pretty good collection of these rare motors. This is another one, and you can see better the stampings. This is stamped. The brackets are stamped, that's stamped, that's stamped. The crankcase pieces are stamped. So, and the tank was stamped and then soldered was stamped. So, oh, yes, it was cheap to make, but boy, they didn't last. So the fact that we have any examples of this is pretty rare. That's my finger pointing at the lower unit of one. So, and seal technology was not what it was. Carl's first step was he took a chunk of clay and dropped it on his desk, literally, in the office of this factory, and he started molding it. So what he did was put lipstick on a pig. Okay, this is a terrible motor, but what he said is if he could make this thing look cool, he could call it a streamliner. So in 1940, he sold the Thor Streamliner, which is just this really cool cowling, I grant you that, which is out of aluminum, you know, stamped aluminum. It's really cool, but underneath, the Thor was still the Thor, okay, unfortunately. The original name was Kieckhafer Mercury, and Carl Kieckhafer had that as a trade name before Ford Motor Company decided to produce a car with a higher status than the Ford, but a less of a status than Lincoln. So there's a famous letter where Henry Ford II wrote a letter to Carl and asked if they could use Mercury. And Carl said, yeah. He thought that that would actually spill over and maybe get him some sales. That he owned the name, but he let them use it for free. So next, this is the first line of Mercury motors. This is 1940. These are the K1s, K for Kieckhafer -1, first motor. And they were lovely already. Here you can see we've got a cast aluminum leg, you know, beautifully done, properly done. He's gotten rid of all of the stampings. He's got at first a stamped steel tank, but it was well done and soldered well. And all of these castings are proper cast steel or cast aluminum. And you can see that already Carl understood that styling sold. And these are very Art Deco, very streamlined, and they look like they're going fast when they sit still. And these motors were built with tremendous quality. I mean, Carl put bearings in things when everybody else is putting bushings. He put needle bearings, ball bearings in this. He called it jeweled watch. He called it like a jeweled watch. But he was very clever. Notice, this is a carburetor. That's a carburetor. And if you can see under that cowling, it's a carburetor. Remember, he's making another line of these for Sea King. Guess what's on the Sea King instead of a carburetor? A mixing valve. So Carl could save money, make money on Montgomery wards. Okay, so he's a very clever guy. So he grew so fast that he blew out of that little factory that we saw at first, and he bought a barn, a dairy barn. And his R&D group was actually in this silo. And he started producing these because from 1941 he had a lot of orders from the New York Boat Show, okay? Until, guess what happened? Okay. So he buys this barn, and the government came out with a famous edict that you could no longer make any recreational products out of aluminum. Instantly. And overnight, all of the outboard motor companies were out of business. I own well, actually the museum owns a copper tanked Evinrude, solid copper, soldered together, because Evinrude had a few legs and bits and cylinders left, but they couldn't make the tank out of aluminum legally. So they got sheet copper. This is before the next edicts came out, banning copper, because the government was concerned aluminum equals aircraft. So they banned it first. So Evinrude actually made a handful of these with copper tanks, but that's for another time. So anyhow, for years the Evinrude people said that if you would take the spark plug out of a Mercury and smell it, you could tell it was built in a barn. You could smell the barn. This is the beginning of feuds that got to be crazy, as we'll see. So at the beginning of the war, so all of those companies went out of business for about 9 months. They just shut the doors because they had no products. We think that this whole conversion of war economy happened right away. It didn't. It was painful. Nobody knew what to do. The contracts weren't coming, and people were starving. So they wanted drones to shoot down. And we have one person here today who actually worked with those Air Force drones. And we're going to see that they were powered by McCulloch air-cooled engines that was a byproduct of Outboards, and also by Keycafer. One of many products that both of these companies made during the war. That's the first drone ever. It was a target drone. It's called the OQ-1 or Radio Plane 1. And it's got a little 2-cylinder opposed boxer engine there made by Reiter, who was the original designer, along with a movie actor, mostly. And Keycafer made them, and McCulloch made them. And the museum owns 2 of these, which you're going to see mounted when we get everything out. Okay, really pretty cool stuff. There's the Keycafer version of that 2-stroke. A couple different versions of it. And this is the 4-stroke version that McCulloch made, and later Keycafer made a version of it, but they made a V, which we'll see, which is really a sophisticated engine. So, in the bottom, Keycafer made a 2-man chainsaw. This thing is about 7 foot long and weighs, I don't know, a couple hundred pounds. And the reason that he did it is that the Department of Defense, at that time War Department, they couldn't get enough wood out of the Pacific Northwest. Believe it or not, lumberjacks and forks and everywhere around here, we're still using 2-man draw saws to cut these trees that were, 10 foot wide and all that stuff. So they hired Keycafer to make a saw and then to go out and sell it. So he had a truck and a team of a couple of guys. He went all over the Pacific Northwest before these other contracts came, challenging lumberjacks to duels on cutting wood. And he would beat them every time, and Carl would always take the heavy end where the engine was with the 2 cylinders, and the other end, which is the light end, he would give to one of his assistants. And they would beat all the lumberjacks, and they would be sold over. And that's how we got enough wood for minesweepers and everything else, because the Northwest was critical, and it wasn't producing as much as they could. They went the wrong direction. Okay, that's that chainsaw close up. Diston, who was an old line saw maker, okay, a manual saw maker, made the chain, and Carl made everything else. Now you can imagine holding on to this with an open pulley and cutting wood all day long. You had to be manlier than most. This is an actual one in a barn in Maine without its 8-foot chain itself. This is a Keycafer electrical generator system that was used to start airplanes. That's in a barn in Maine. And that's another Keycafer thing with a very beautiful cast aluminum cover and tank there. Now, after the war, Carl saw a lot of possibilities for outboard motors, and they were all hopeful in the new economy. But it was a very crowded field by this time. So he hired an MIT professor, okay, Charlie Strang, who was an unbelievable genius, and also a very patient man. He lived at home with his mother until he was 45 years old. And it's a long story of Carl and Charlie's association and the things that they invented together. Charlie later became head of OMC, for which Carl never forgave him. This is a post-war Kiefer motor, which to me looks like a spaceship. It's got these cast aluminum cups over the spark plugs. It's a sand cast two-piece aluminum tank, and all of the decals and everything else, it looks like it's going 100 miles an hour. And it looks like it came out of a comic book. Because really, this is before jet planes still. It was really sleek and really neat. There's more than a few of those in a barn in Maine. Here's his advertisements for the jeweled power head. Everything was roller bearing. Everything was ball bearing. And so they would rev higher, and they would last really a long time. Carl was a fanatic for using the best materials and the best possible motor. He wasn't Thor at all. This is his company picture, and you can tell maybe from some of his expressions that he's kind of a tough guy. He's a real tyrant to work for, okay? This is a catalog, I believe in 1951, of some of the motors. And you can see he's selling using airplane pilots. Airplanes are still sexy then. Being a pilot is very glamorous, so he hired real pilots to do the advertisements. This cowling, there's one of these in a barn in Florida that's way to Maine, is cast aluminum. It's about a 1/4 inch thick, some places 3/8. A work of art, sand cast. So here's more from that catalog, that 1951 catalog, highlighting all of these quality features, and this was indeed, and they were through the 60s until Carl left. They were all engineered beautifully and beautifully built. Now this is a famous green-headed series that came out in 1951. Many of you may remember from your youth. A lovely cowl out of pressed steel, a cast aluminum band that ran around it, the chain band, which is frequently broken from being dropped. And the really, really nice outboards. They had them in a whole range of horsepowers and beautifully built. By the way, that guy that's sitting there is a man named Cameron Waterman. Cameron Waterman made the first production motors in the United States. He built them in 1906 through a Detroit company called Kale, who made slot machines and had a tool room that would do odd jobs. So Cameron, the first 25 ever sold and made, this is 4 years before Evinrude, were made by Cameron Waterman. But Evinrude, the salespeople would always run around and say that only Evinrude invented the outboard motor. He didn't. This used to frost Carl Kiefer to no end. He would get literally red in the face and started ranting because, Evinrude did not invent the outboard motor. So he brought Cameron Waterman. He digs this guy out of Detroit. He's a successful here. Gets him to come to the New York Boat Show and gives him a giant motor as a free gift to highlight and to have Cameron Waterman tell his tale of inventing the outboard motor.
Larry?
Yeah.
Yeah, are these all two-cycle motors now?
They're all two-cycle.
Okay.
Yeah. There was a 4-cycle briefly in the teens, the late teens in Evinrude, and it was a disaster. It was so bad that they called them all back and scrapped them.
Okay.
The first real American 4-cycle, and that was the first one in the world, was done by Crosley, a guy named Lou Faggio, who's a hydroplane racer,
Right.
slow motion 4.
Right.
He's the one that produced that using the Crosley
really?
engine. And he also produced a V-drive out of that and a pod.
Right, that's the motor that I learned water ski behind.
Absolutely.
And the first thing we did every summer was my dad and I would take the thing apart.
Yeah, and service it, yeah. I'm glad you pointed it out because that just jogged my mind again.
I
Carl.
was very young and my ankles were still in water.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for sure. I remember the same thing for me. That's a 7.5 up horsepower. Until 62, you could guarantee that it would be double that. Carl sandbagged every horsepower rating so that when on your lake, your Mercury would outdo every Johnson and Evinrude because it was deliberately more horsepower, but he wouldn't tell you that. Okay, so it was so bad the other manufacturers sued him to come under the American Powerboat Association definition of dynamometer or horsepower. That was about 62. So he was a real character, but a definite genius in how to sell things. These are widely used on hydroplanes, the KH-7, the 10s, which again you could count maybe 18 horse. So remember all those little tiny plywood hydros, and some of them are here to use in. And they're called the Hurricane. And I mean, really beautiful brochures. And as a child, I still, I love to read the specs. As an adult, I still love to read the specs. If you want to sell me something, tell me about the specs. Don't give me a commercial of, you know, a Kia going through the nighttime with blurry lights and a jazzy tune. What does that tell me about the car? Anyhow, this is the 10-horse Hurricane. That one's in a barn in Florida right there with that cast iron, or cast aluminum case. Beautiful motor. Water skiing prior to 1950. This is all about hunters and fishermen. This is the market for outboard motors. There was no other market. But Carl Kiefer and Ralph Evinrude saw this as a family thing. And Ralph learned it from his mother, Bess, you know, who was the original marketing genius behind Evinrude. So they started now to show in these catalogs, you can see people water skiing, and this is a whole new market. They didn't want to get rid of the fishing guys, but they wanted to do the water skiing, and that meant higher horsepower. Look at the difference now between 1951 and 1955. We're up to about 35 horsepower in a short amount of time. Between 1950, which I think the biggest motor was 16 horse, in 1962, we went from 16 horse to 100. Carl came out with an inline 6 with 100 horse in less than 10 years, and all of it was driven by water skiing. Now, Carl's true love after 1953 was stock car racing. He made NASCAR. Okay, he came up with everything from the pit crew, we'll see in a minute, to paper oil filters, you name it, because he was running Baja and the engines would get clogged up in the intake. He took a sport that was a bunch of good old boys meeting together on Friday, and he made it professional. He would fly his entire engineering department to a race site to tinker with the Chrysler 300s that he raced from 1953 until NASCAR banned him in 1956 for no reason. They just banned him because he was winning 90% of the races. Carl invented the paper air cleaner, which you can see located on the top of most motors these days. And this is Carl giving his drivers a talk. And when you drove for Carl, you won or you were unemployed the next race. I mean, this is the kind of guy he was. He's a little bit like Robert Penske, I suppose. He invented the pit crew in that he came up with a system to organize. Each person had a task. And they'd all wait, the car would stop, and they'd all spring out. And nobody had ever done this before. And he had the money and the resources to do it. These good old boys from Tennessee, you know, were rum runners originally. That's what made NASCAR. They couldn't afford that. So he beat the pants off them, and they were not appreciative. Now, we said that Carl was a character. When he would have sales meetings, this is an Evinrude motor. It's brand new. He bought 3 of them one summer, got all of his guys together, put it on a teepee upside down. He's dressed as an Indian chief. And he set it on fire until it melted into an ingot. There was nothing left. Now, this was a lot of money, but he did this, and he had all of his sales guys go around in a circle like this to get them psyched to defeat Evinrude. Now, the rivalry back and forth, to give you an example, is that motor, the later iteration was a V4. That's the way Ralph Evinrude went to get his horsepower. He went with a V4. Well, the Mercury salesman called that the Fat 50, the Fat 50 horsepower. And Carl went straight up with inline cylinders. So the Evinrude salesman would say, look, that thing is so top heavy that you could flip your boat if you make a sharp turn. And that really just made Kiefer go crazy. So we'd do all these tests and get USAC and other agencies to come in and prove that his motors did not cause boats to flip over. So this is just emblematic of how bitter the relationship was. It was so bitter, in fact, that you see the guy on the right, Jim Wynn, was the number 3 guy after Charlie Strang at Mercury. And so Charlie Strang invented the inboard outboard system. And in '57, he went to Carl with it. Carl says, that's crap, so we don't need that. Not going to work. We're doing outboards. And so Charlie Strang tried to sell him. No sale. Carl knew everything. So Charlie talked to Jim Wynn, the number 3 guy, and he said, look, he said, if I come up with this on my own, Carl will fire me. And Jim Wynn said, I've had enough anyhow. Why don't you just give it to me and I'll produce it. So in secret, the 2 of them sold this idea to Volvo Penta. And Volvo Penta came out with the world's first commercial inboard outboard in 1959, and it was one of Carl's head engineer's design that Carl ignored. Now, it was so successful that within a couple of years he had to found Mercruiser and do it himself, but he was late in catching up for years because of his own arrogance. So it's an incredible story, really. 1962, Carl's Triumph was the inline 6 that was the first 100-horse motor. And it was a beautifully done thing. It's stainless steel wrapper. This is stainless here. This collar, one piece, wraps around, a lovely aluminum plate. The original front pieces were cast aluminum sand cast. So, but he's haunted by this. The boat's going to flip over because now he's got 6 cylinders straight up in the air. So he's sitting in a conference room with Charlie Strang and the other engineers, and they've got the prototype of this motor, and it's white. You remember that they changed from green to white when they did the larger motors. So all during the 50s, you got these white Mercuries with this lovely wrapper. So Carl's saying, this is, we just can't put this thing out there. We're going to get slaughtered. We got to think of a way to make it look smaller. Charlie Strang's mother comes in to the conference room. She's got Charlie's lunch. Charlie's 45 years old. He's still living at home. His mother brings him lunch. So she says, what are you boys doing? They said, well, we got this new motor. We're just trying to figure out how to make it small, or look small. And she says, well, when a woman wants to look, smaller, she wears black. Carl jumps up, gets all excited, starts issuing orders. He sends one guy to run down to the tool room and get a spray can of black paint. He pushes orders to somebody else to get, some coverings for the furniture. Anyhow, in the conference room, 5 minutes later, they spray paint this motor, and it looks smaller. So Carl issues his immortal edict, paint them black. And from 1962 on, all Mercuries were black until fairly recently you couldn't get them in any color black. And that was why, because they were in line in those times, okay, and looked big. Now Mercury even has a V4. So that's the story of Make It Black. And this is actually from the original catalog. Carl was the first one to put the exhaust through the hull of the propeller so that it came out underwater. It didn't stink as much because it was coming out aft of your boat, and also muffled some of the sound. So here is the 80-horse white one, which is as big as they've gotten, side by side with the black. In the 62 catalog, only the 100 horse is black. The next year they were all black. So you had that one transition year. And here's that. This is all from a catalog that is now in the possession of the May family collection in their library. And you can see that there's something else strange here. You see how these things are tilted like this? They found that the fishing motors, in the way that they were constructing them to go fast, they had problems with them at idle, because they also had to idle down in troll, because fishermen wanted to troll. And they had problems with pooling in the carburetor somehow. So Carl came up with this idea of tilting them. So all of the motors in this generation, until they solved that technical problem, had this cant to them. Even when they're straight up and down, they look slightly forward, okay? And even the cowlings were tilted. Now, by 62, Carl spent so much money on stock car racing that he had bankrupted PK for Mercury. All the profits were spent on stock car racing. So he was forced to sell. And he sold to AMF Brunswick, which you may remember is the company that ruined Harley Davidson and amongst almost all the other companies that they bought by making things cheaper. So Carl sold out, and he stayed another 5 years. But AMF was about making it cheap, making it fast, making big profits, and Carl was not like that. So there began a titanic battle of wills between the Brunswick management and Carl. What Carl did get out of it was this brand new factory in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, which he designed. And Brunswick did have money at that time, and he got him to build this factory. So they're having the grand opening. You got the ribbons and all that kind of stuff. The guys are there from Brunswick, and at the last second, they're going to have a bulldozer, a little scrape, it's like, the shoveling. Carl jumps off the podium, runs over to this D8 cat or whatever it is, gets on the seat of the bulldozer, starts it up, and starts plowing the ground. And the Brunswick people, about came unglued because they had no idea that Carl was a real farmer, could run any kind of piece of equipment, But Carl just had to have that, he was the groundbreaking guy, and then he aced out all of the Brunswick people. So, anyhow, they kept going on from this to, 110 horsepower until today. We have 350 horsepower outboard motors that are V8s. They're, basically car engines stood on their nose. So you can find Yamaha, and everybody has them. These are the beginnings of the Black Mercury, 63 and on. But the story ends sadly. By 67, Carl couldn't stand no longer being able to run his own baby without getting permission, going to meetings, writing memos, begging for money, and all this other stuff, so he quit. He quit with a lot of money, but he quit. And for a time, he was on Brunswick's board of directors, but he just couldn't handle this corporate stuff. He was used to being king, like King Lear in Shakespeare. So what he did is he went and he did snowmobiles more. He did key caper snowmobiles. And he started to build offshore inboard outboards for racing, like Bermuda racing, all that. Became very famous in that. And died later. The date that he died is in the list, but I want to say it was at the 83. Yeah. So that's Carl. Any questions about Carl? Why don't we take a break? And then for anybody that's interested, for a second hour, which you're not obligated to do, I always stop this because I could talk for days, as you would figure. We'll do World War II.
He's a good friend of mine, and that's true.
Yeah. We're going to talk about Scott Outboard McCullough, Chris Kraft, Oliver, Crosley, which made outboard motors of Faggio, Martin, which was owned by Presto Pressure Cooker, and we could do Water Witch and more on radio plane. Or you could go have a nice Saturday. Thanks for listening. We'll take a break. And then we'll come back. The next section is going to be on McCullough and Scott Atwater. Robert Paxson McCullough was a real character in his own right. He was born of a very wealthy family, and he was everything that Carl Kiecafer wasn't in terms of background. And Kiecafer and McCullough hated each other because Kiecafer was a Depression farm boy. They didn't have two nickels to rub together, and McCullough was born into a very rich family of privilege and everything, and went to Ivy League schools, and boy, that just didn't sit well with Carl. So that's a picture, and this is roughly the outline of the Scott Outwater Company. In 1932, a guy named Dumont had an idea for an outboard. He was going to call it Champion. So he went to this machine shop in Minneapolis. It was run by two guys, Scott and Atwater. They were just a general machine shop. And Dumont said, I got this idea for a motor. Would you make it for me? And he said, sure. Just one of their general tasks. So they started producing these Champion motors, and it became pretty popular. So throughout the 30s, they made these motors called Champions. There's a number of them, well, there's actually 50 of them in a barn in Maine, shall we say. And what happened was, during the war, like everybody, they made parts and pieces for the defense. After the war, Dumont goes to Scott and Atwater and says, oh, by the way, I just built my own factory. I don't need you anymore. I mean, absolutely no advance warning. He goes and cuts them off. And Scott and Atwater got this, by this time, a pretty good sized plant where they're building these outboards. And out of self-defense, they decided to make Scott Atwater outboards because they were going to go under, because all this tooling and stuff they had. So they designed their own outboards. Basically, they were the first at the same time as Johnson to come up with forward, neutral, and reverse as we know it today. Really fully functioning forward, neutral, reverse in 49. They came up with a thing called bail-o-matic, which is a puck with a little tube on it, and you would put it in your rowboat. You remember at this time, rowboats in the 50s were mostly wood in the early part of the 50s. Therefore, they mostly leak. And they also would have rainwater, so you put this little puck down in the bottom of the boat near the transom, and a little hose up into the leg of the motor, and it would bail your boat, or at least that was the theory. It was called the bail-o-matic. It was more like the peanut butter-matic because of the problems with it. So, in 56, Scott and Outboard are pretty old by this time. They sell out to McCullough, who wants to get into the outboard motor business. And in 1959, McCullough, whose background was aircraft and also automobile accessories, decides to come up with a radical new outboard motor that's a radial, built like a radial aircraft engine. So he built one, from scratch. And he had to go around the run of the boat shows in 1959, New York and so forth, and it looked like a spaceship. And after that, he had it made as a cutaway. They'd done all their engineering studies, and he had it as a cutaway, and it went to a couple more boat shows. That motor is featured in the 1959 popular mechanics article, about this motor. That motor belongs to the LeMay family collection now. It's going to be mounted down here in the rifle range where the pickup trucks are, on the wall. And not only the pod that it's set in, but the actual working cutaway model of a radial outboard motor, 4-cylinder radial that made 120 horse. The reason it didn't get produced was it was too expensive at the time to manufacture for that amount of horsepower. So this is an example of a McCullough counter-rotating propeller drone motor that McCullough made for the Army when they were starting to do these drones at the beginning of World War II. This is the 4-cylinder one that you can see, barely just see the 4 cylinders. This is a picture of an actual one. These were made up into the 70s because they were so good. Basically, his business was chainsaws. It was aeronautics first, then he started to make chainsaws and made quite a bit of chainsaws. Was very successful, and then he wanted to get into outboards. He also took those same motors, the chainsaw motors, and capitalized on this go-kart market, which in the middle 50s, as we all remember, started to take off and lasted for like 10 years and continues to this day. But it was really popular for about a 10-year period. So McCullough chainsaw motors converted for go-kart use are to this day pretty expensive. The other thing that he did is he loved automobiles and accessories, so he made a supercharger that was used on some early 50s cars. I think there was a Studebaker that used these in a Hawk. I think it was the Hawk. And he called them Paxson. That was his middle name, Robert Paxson McCullough. And that company still exists. He sold it, but they made superchargers, just like Lou Faggio made superchargers.
They put them on Packards too.
Yeah,
They're
you're right.
Corrigan,
That's right.
and Thunderbirds had them too.
Oh, there, I didn't know that.
Dual. Two.
Cool. Well, that's cool. He also, his first love was aircraft. So this is a helicopter that he made for the Navy in the early 50s. It didn't last long. It was a twin rotor thing, and it flew off of ships. There's one in the Smithsonian and one in the Air and Space, or the Air Force's Museum in Ohio. There's another picture of the thing. I think the glass, it was primarily designed for rescues, so hence the glass floor. He also took that same 4-cylinder air-cooled motor that he'd used on drones, and he made this helicopter, which didn't sell badly. And I think that was up through the 70s. These things are still for sale if you go on eBay, and are quite highly priced because it's they call it a gyrocopter, but it's basically an individual person's 4-man helicopter, because you got this cheap 72 horse, 2-stroke, proven engine that you can use to power the thing. McCullough had a really big ego. So he heard about a bankruptcy sale of 16,000 acres in Arizona along a stream. So he went to the courthouse, and on the steps of the courthouse, he bought 16,000 acres of desert, in a bankruptcy sale. And then from this, he decided to create a place called Lake Havasu, Arizona. And Lake Havasu is going to be this giant development of houses. It's going to have a lake. And he was going to move all of his factories there. He actually did. His chainsaw stuff, he moved on everything to Lake Havasu. And he started selling these things. You were alive in the 50s and early 60s. You probably remember people trying to sell lots at Lake Havasu. So the other thing that he did was, he had been to London, and he had seen this bridge. He actually saw a couple of bridges. The London Bridge and Tower Bridge. And so the borough of London, or the city of London, decided to sell the London Bridge. And the London Bridge is not the one with the 2 big towers. That's the Tower Bridge. Okay, London Bridge is a pretty average looking bridge. So the general folklore in the UK, because I lived there 6 years and I worked out of there for 30, was that McCullough didn't know that he was buying the London Bridge, which is an ordinary bridge. He thought he was buying the Tower Bridge. And when it showed up in the desert, which is where he was going to put it, and he was quite embarrassed. Now, there are a lot of authorities that vary on this. But yeah, what he did, in the middle of the desert, you can see, he started scooping out sand, and this thing would have been disassembled in London and numbered, literally, block by block by block. And he redoes it in the desert, in the middle of nowhere, right? And so when he gets it done, that's what it looks like, because he scooped out a lake and built all these houses, and he built a runway, and he built his set of factories there. So the guy was an amazing guy, and that is London Bridge at Lake Havasu, Arizona. And it dates from the 1750s or so. So he's a pretty wild guy. There's another picture of it. That's the bridge that everybody thinks he thought he was buying, which is the Tower Bridge, which of course is still there across from the Tower of London. And the HMS Belfast is floating just a little bit to the right of this. It's about here, which is a World War II heavy cruiser, which I was honored to be able to tour about 2 months ago. Next, the story of a rich boy in a Minneapolis machine shed. We talked in general about Scott Outboard. This is their logo, and we talked about how that evolved out of the Champion line. That's the actual Scott Outboard factory. It took me 5 years to find a photograph of the actual factory, which is in many cases, some of these places weren't real glamorous that started up after the Depression and after World War II. It was a machine shed. It was a series of sheds on a railway. But they made really nice outboard motors, albeit a bit cranky. My second outboard motor was a 5-horse Scott Outboard. First it was a Belgian. And these may look familiar to you if you were alive in the early 50s. These are in Field and Stream. There's in Boys Life. Every kind of outdoor magazine you could find would have these lovely green headed. These were Kelly green with a nice aluminum band around it. And they were good motors. They did have a cranky carburetor and a cranky big knob on the things to choke that you would press. But I don't know. I love the thing. That's one of them that's in the museum's collection. It needs paint desperately, but that's the little 5-horse from the side. It needs a bit of work. So, McCullough's goal was to be #1 in Outboards. He wanted to beat Johnson, Evinrude, and Mercury. Those were the standards. So what he did was he hired the #1 industrial designer of the day, Raymond Lloyd, depending on who you talk to. Raymond Lloyd later did Air Force One with Jackie Kennedy. That was the plane that took Kennedy to Dallas and brought Lyndon Johnson back. He was quite a designer. He could make a pencil sharpener or a toaster that looked like it was going to do Mach 3. It was all Art Deco and swept back. And there's Lloyd with a model of Air Force One, which all of us take for granted as the standard picture of a presidential plane. And that indeed is a pencil sharpener that he designed. It looks like it's doing 100 miles an hour. So Raymond Lloyd was very much an Art Deco, Art Nouveau guy. In fact, you see all those logos? Those are all logo and national corporate symbols that his design company designed over the years. He had his studios in New York City. He was the #1 guy. He designed at the 20th Century Limited a number of steam engines, diesel locomotives, you name it, but it all looked cool. He also was the contract designer from 1946 through the end of Studebaker. And he designed the Hawk, the Golden Hawk, and the Avante. And the Avante, of course, nearly saved Studebaker, but it was a little bit too late. But he was a French guy, and he was in World War I in the French army in the trenches. And so his design concept was always a little bit European, and always a little bit too something for American taste. There was something about a Raymond Lloyd design that an art connoisseur would like, but the general person didn't buy it. So it was an odd relationship. He had some beautiful cars. And the museum has some of these in their collection. It has a lovely amount there. And in front of us. But what he did was he hired, so McCullough hires Lowy to design the cowls. The covers for the outboard motors. Because really, an outboard is, a leg, a propeller, and some kind of, machine on top that you're going to shroud in something. So that became the outboard. And what drew me originally to outboard motors was the shape of all of these covers. They were infinitely different they could be. So he came up with painting, all these different colors and a pretty cool fiberglass cover. But really what the masterstroke was, there's a version of this where he has 12 models dressed in Catalina swimsuits in 12 different colors, standing next to an outboard motor that's painted the same color as the bathing suit. And this was an advertising triumph. I mean, this was a shot heard around the world. This doubled Scott Atwater's demand overnight in terms of the number of outboards that they had sold. And here's some of those models. But you can see that the design is futuristic, somewhat elegant, and also somewhat quirky. There's all of those that you see there are in a barn in Maine. And if I can get them here, I will. So McCullough's reality for aircraft was the radial engine. And since he was interested in outboards, as we said, that's actually a copy of the 1959 Power Mechanics article describing this experimental radial outboard motor, which about a couple of weeks from now will be mounted down here in the gun room. There's only one. It was found in a barn on Whidbey Island in an estate sale, and it was donated here. So it's pretty cool, and it is a working cutaway. So you can see, you have cylinder here, one around this side, to in a plus shape, 4 cylinders, 120 horse. And this pod is taller than I am, had a variable speed propeller, so the pitch, just like a turboprop airplane, when it reverses its propeller pitch, at an airplane, it uses it to slow down the plane, that you can change the pitch from the switch on the dash. Yeah, it had a turbo. So this is really a sophisticated piece of equipment for 1959. The last thing I'm going to show you has nothing to do with outboards, but I couldn't help myself. There's a guy named Dobler who designed steam cars in the teens and 20s, and he had the most sophisticated steam cars, but they never sold well because they were expensive. But his best one, when you flip the switch on the boiler, you could have steam in 14 seconds. That's where he stopped in the 30s. Well, McCullough in '57 wanted to design a steam car in the worst way. So he resurrected this guy, who was in his late 80s by this time, but very agile, very smart, and they went together to design this car. And the design of the body of the car, this thing was just sold and restored and is now visible to the public again. The design was done by Brooks Stevenson. And this is an article in Road and Track in April of '57 talking about, does the steam car have a future? And the name of the car was the Phoenix, the Paxton Phoenix, his ego again. But it was really cool, and if you get a chance to read this article, I think you'll be very fascinated with how the thing was designed, where they put the boiler, what the whole concept of the suspension, he hired suspension engineers out of the automobile industry just to handle this thing. It is really, really something, but it shows the guy's genius. So there's, you can see the boiler in the front, and yes?
They only made one?
Yeah, they only made one. Fortunately, it exists. Now, the steam bit exists somewhere, and nobody knows quite where that bit is, because it ended up with a gas engine in it later on from another owner. But the car still exists, and all the drawings exist. So that's the steam car. So that's that.
Gee, I know, I haven't tried that.
No, but I wouldn't be surprised if he's tried. I'd perhaps give him long enough if he won't. That's amazing. So let's see here. The next one we can go is, would you like Chris Craft? Don't you hear about Chris Craft? Outboard Motors?
I remember.
Okay. It's a pretty interesting story because it, wait a second, that's the wrong one. It ties into Carl Kiefer. Okay. Chris Craft, as you probably remember, at the beginning of the 50s, was the preeminent manufacturer, certainly 50, 52, You know, before fiberglass, they're the preeminent boat builder in the country in terms of numbers. They have all kinds of lovely mahogany boats and, you know, are about to get into fiberglass. Well, they decided that they wanted to make outboard motors. So what they did was they made a huge decision and a big mistake. They decided to build a factory from scratch in Grand Rapids, Michigan to produce these new motors. These things would be state of the art. That was all great. The mistake was they hired 4 engineers away from Carl Kiekhaefer. And he was furious. I mean, you know, Carl was vindictive. So these guys went to work for Chris Craft and designed this really cool outboard motors, a 5 and a 10. And there they are there, the Challenger and the Commander. And they were, you know, you say pretty handsome motors. Again, metal cowlings, beautifully built, all bearings. The problem was this lower unit, the patent attorney decided there was a 95% similarity to the patents that Mercury had. They made the mistake of copying Carl's lower unit designs, which were patented. So the thing went to court, and Carl agreed to drop the suit if they would sell the company. Carl was really afraid of Chris Craft. Chris Craft had enormous resources, and he was afraid that they could put him out of business because they were multiple times bigger than his little outboard company. You know, so he really wanted to try to neutralize them. So this is in '53, I believe. So Chris Craft agreed to do that. So they sold the building and everything to another company. Here's the timeline. They started it in '49, and they had to sell. In '54, they sold to Oliver Tractor, Oliver Farm Tractor, which was a lovely company to making tractors for what, I don't know, you know, decades by this time. And Oliver Tractor saw this is an opportunity to make money, you know, outside of farm goods. It's a going thing. So they bought this stuff, and they had a bridge here where it looked like a Chris Craft and halfway to an Oliver, and then they had a whole new design. Unfortunately, in 1960, they decided to send the production to Great Britain. I don't know if you remember anything about British production in the late 60s or in the early 60s, but anything you built there was problematic. You know, from an MG to a Triumph or whatever. Quality control was terrible. And within a year, the motors were so bad that they sold out to Perkins, actually, who was a diesel engine maker in Great Britain. That lasted 2 years later. So here's some more pictures of these 2 Chris Craft outboards, the 5 and the 10. They're really pretty motors and beautifully made in this special built factory. Yeah, they're pretty much state of the art in '53. There's the factory. I mean, even it was Art Deco. They were very sophisticated, of course, with their sales and marketing, because Chris Craft had been in the boat business for a long time. They came out of it. And here's actually the ad for when before they sold to Oliver, they were going to sell the stuff for scrap. So this is actually a newspaper clipping of them selling the machine tooling in a sale for $50,000. That's what they were going to do before Oliver Tractor stepped in. So this is a letter from, we'll see right here, from Charlie Strang, because Charlie was there. This is a letter from to the Antique Outboard Motor Club in answer to their question of what really happened, because Charlie was there at Kiekhaefer when this lawsuit happened. So Charlie tells the story that I just told you in a lot more detail about the lawsuit and, you know, the details and what went on. But it's a really interesting and fascinating story of egos, patent infringement, and you name it. Here's more of the motor with its specs. They were all called the K series. That's the Challenger, the 5-horse. And here's Oliver Tractors. At the time when they bought them, Oliver Tractor was also hiring industrial designers. They hired really good industrial designers like Brooks Stevenson. And, you know, Tractor by this time plowed. So if you want to, and they were all reliable, from farm all to international, you name it. So you had to distinguish yourself with something. So Oliver had some really pretty designs. If you go to a tractor show, which I have in Swindon, and you see some of these old Olivers, they're really pretty. So it's not that weird that they decided to buy this company. So these are original Oliver ads for gas and diesel tractors. And this is the bridge here. They bought Chris Craft, and you remember what that looked like. And the good news was they tried to change it to Oliver because they were forced to. That's good. The bad news is they started to make it like a tractor. The 10 horse and the 5 horse double in weight. In a barn in Maine, again. All of these models are lined up, and they are twice as heavy. And they're beautiful, built like beautiful stuff, but they're just way overbuilt, because that's what Oliver knew. I mean, you made a tractor, you made it heavy. This is a beautiful little motor with a fiberglass cowling, but it's a 5 horse that weighs 75 pounds. I mean, way heavier than anything else, but it's really pretty. And they sold all of their farm tractor skills about how beautifully these were manufactured. They weren't joking, they were nicely done. And you can see the industrial designers here had a field day making these things. In '50, it looked like spaceships. And they were beautifully designed, I think. By the time Perkins bought them, their reputation was mud. And actually, Perkins was a company that was subcontracted to build them in the UK, build the Olivers, and they did a terrible job. This is about the last year, and this was the Perkins trade name. Probably most people don't know that there were Perkins Outboards, but again, the barn in Maine, there are 5 Perkins. It took a total of 8 years to find. Pretty much daily haunting eBay and Craigslist on 2 coasts to find it. There's another one, that's a 6. There's the 16, 35, and 40. One of the things that both Oliver and Perkins were faced with is, at this time, everybody else was going on 35, and Oliver didn't have the capital. That was another reason for them to sell to Perkins. They didn't have the capital to go to 100 horse. And Johnson, Evinrude, and Mercury by this time are producing 50, 60, 70 horses. And they couldn't keep up, so what they sold was using 235s as being the same as a 70. And they're not, and nobody bought it, along with all the associated extra maintenance. And finally, I think this is the last slide. This was the final Perkins Oliver design. If that doesn't look like a spaceship, I don't know what was. It didn't get built, but I think that photograph of the design is really cool. So, how are you doing in terms of survival? Are you ready to go on, or are you ready to stop? I understand if you want to go one more manufacturer. Okay. If you do have to go, I understand. Let's see. How about Martin? Martin, although I know a lot about a fair amount about outboard motors, I didn't know anything about these people until I started collecting. And these are fabulous little motors. Okay, most of us have a Presto pressure cooker from the late 40s, early 50s. It was quite a popular thing for a while, and they were made out of aluminum, and the museum has one that was donated as a part of this stuff. There's a racer named George Martin. He was a racer in the 40s. He was a very successful outboard motor racer. And he had an idea for a new outboard motor that would involve rotary valves. Most of the valves at this time were flutter valves or reed valves. It's just a piece of spring steel that moves back and forth to shut off the outside air to the crankcase when the piston is coming down in the cylinder. You have to do that, otherwise it would blow back through the carburetor, because most 2-strokes have the carburetor off of the crankcase. So it was a really nice design, but it was going to be expensive. So he went to National Pressure Cooker, Presto Pressure Cooker in Wisconsin, and said, "You guys know aluminum? I know this engine. Everybody's buying outboard motors. Let's make a new one. We'll call it Martin. Here's my design." So the board of directors met, and they said, "That sounds good." So Presto Pressure Cooker went into the outboard business, just like West Bend did, because they knew aluminum. This is actually the National Presto Pressure Cooker Industries factory, which still exists in Wisconsin. And that is the one that's donated to the museum, which you probably recognize and may have had when I was a kid. So the timeline was in 43, he made the deal, but the production didn't start until 46. And in 54, National Pressure Cooker was in the same position as these other companies. They're going to have to spend a lot of money to get higher horsepower motors, and they decided not to. So they had a board of directors meeting on a Friday. The chairman of the board says to the board of directors, gentlemen, the future is in pressure cookers, not outboard motors. This would be one of the worst corporate decisions in history. I don't know how many pressure cookers you've seen lately, but if you compare that to the number of outboards, this is an unbelievable decision. So that's Friday afternoon. Monday morning, the workers come in, there's a sign on the door. Out of business. I had no idea. So there were 10 rail car loads of parts, dies, tools, everything from knobs to car, you name it, okay? They were going to scrap. And a farmer in Nebraska found out about it and bought all 12 rail cars and put them in his barns. And today, you can buy any part for a Martin outboard motor from that same guy. Larson is his name. He's got adverts all over, and he has all those parts original, and he's dedicated to making Martins keep running. So he doesn't gouge, he gives you these original equipment parts to keep these Martins going. It's really kind of an interesting story. That's what the Martins look like. A number of nice features here. There's dogs here and here, which counts enough, but when you set this motor down on the ground, it's lands squarely on those dogs. Doesn't mess up the carburetor or the knobs, right? And behind here is a handhold, and it balances perfectly. When you pick it up, it's balanced fore and aft. And when you set it down on those dogs, it doesn't get messed up. This motor would spin 360 degrees because they didn't have gear shift at first. They did the typical doing it a reverse to spin the motor around. But what's really cool is you see that knob there. All other outboard motors, when you wanted to change the angle of that outboard motor to the transom, you would pull the motor up a bit, pull out a pin, let it down to where you wanted, and push that pin back through a set of pre-drilled holes. It was a pain in the butt. And usually somebody ended up dropping the pin in the water. So, you see bolts and all kinds of stuff in those holes. This is a knob that you twist. And when you twist it in one direction, the leg comes up. You twist it in the other direction, the leg goes down. All Martins had that. They're really elegant design. And they had rotary valves, even the little tiny ones. They run like watches. To this day, you can find a Martin for $100. And if it's not seized, you'll be able to restore it to nearly new condition. So I became a big Martin fan, and this is pretty much the big mistake. This is in the early 50s. Who were we marketing to? One category, hunter and fishermen. Where was the market going? Families and water skiing. So they didn't quite get it. The name of the character was Marty, that they invented to sell this. This guy was known as Marty Outboards. So they're really lovely motors. If you can find one of these, good time with it.
Yeah, we raced one for a few years.
Did you?
The hybrids, yeah.
They had a 20 horse, which you'll see in a minute, which is really a lovely motor. This is the 10, and by this time they had the radical invention of twist throttle, which had been around for, 20 years. They were late to the party. But they had, there's a little thing that looks like a sight gauge. It looks like a thermometer, but it's a sight gauge. And you could actually see the gasoline level in the tank through this glass tube, which was pretty cool. They had trouble getting it to seal though. And that's the Martin line. That's the Martin 60. And that's how nice they look when they're restored. This has been called the Corvette of Outboards. They're 20 horse, which is their dying gasp. They made 299 of these. They're very rare. They only made them for 1 year. And it's just beautiful. You got the sight gauge here, you've got all your knobs here. It really does look like the dash of a sports car. Lovely motor. And then they had that meeting, and the chairman of the board said the future's in pressure cookers, and it was gone overnight. This is that Martin 200, or 20 horse, on a feathercraft, which is an aluminum boat made in Atlanta, Georgia, with a barrel back. And I think the two of them together are a lovely combination. They made a series of these boats down as low as 12 foot long, where you sat in the center, and they were designed even with low horsepower motors, you could fly. Because this boat only weighed like 200 pounds.
There's a few of those around here.
Yeah, the 49 through 53, they made this particular design. Okay, that's Martin. Let's see if there's anything that we haven't last one will be, we'll do Crosley Faggio. This will be the last one. Okay, there's a guy named Powell Crosley and his brother. Crosley in about 1922 went to a local radio store. His son wanted to get a radio. And at that time, the state of the art was a crystal wireless set. And it was going to cost about the same amount as a year's salary. And he was astonished by this price. So at that point, he decided to go into manufacturing of radios. So he did, and he became the Henry Ford of radio. He brought radios to the masses by making them mass-produced and inexpensive. And his brother was the production genius. He was also an officer in World War I. And in the biography of the Crosley brothers, you find out that the brother was in charge of a bunch of German prisoners, 200 of them. And the Allies, the team that he had 10 guys with rifles, 10 U.S. soldiers. So 2 Germans came up and said, we've been elected by the representatives of the prisoners here, and we demand this and we demand that, or we're not going to work. So the brother said, if you don't go back to work, I'll shoot you. And they said, ha, 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 ha. So they refused to go back to work. So he pulled his M19, his 1911 Colt, popped one in the head, popped the other one in the head, and all the Germans went to work. At that time, that was Paul Crosley's brother, was 21 years old. Needless to say, this guy was tough enough to be an industrialist. So he was. Here's their first crystal receiver model. This is like 23 or something, but you can see 22, $25. And with the bake-like headsets, bake-like headsets. And they had a whole range of these, and they created a market for radio that basically wasn't there because it was affordable. There's only one problem. There weren't any radio stations in 1922. So he got a license in Cincinnati to start his own radio station. And he had to put on his own talent. So one of the first people produced these shows. And he eventually had a 1 million watt AM transmitter. This is before the 50,000 watt limit. He was selling sales ads in Argentina, in South America, because you hear this thing anywhere, you know. One of his first singers was a young 18-year-old girl named Doris Day, who got her start on this station in Ohio. I mean, it's a fascinating story. This is a one-tube model as he progressed along the way. Always economical and some styling. This is called a tombstone or Gothic. There's, depending on how much sculpture it's got, that could arguably be a Gothic. The tombstone is more square. There's a lovely radio collection over in the school here as a part of the complex. I think it's 600 radios. Somebody has donated those 10 times more than I do, but I love the architecture of these and the story across this. That would be a tombstone. This would be a cathedral. So they always had nice cabinets, and in those days you had shortwave as well as AM, so you could listen to Radio Berlin or anything. And then he discovered Bakelite. He would make radios out of anything that he could do economically, anything with color, or he was a great marketer. He made refrigerators. This is called the Shelvador, and this was his invention. It's patented. Nobody had ever used the door for storage before. He invented the idea of using the door with shelves in it. It's called a Shelvador. And he outsold General Electric and all these Cold Spot, which was a Sears thing. Amazing sales guy, this guy.
He also used ammonia sulfide for refrigerant instead of freon.
Yeah, he did. Yes. Nothing got in the way of production.
Yeah.
So right around about the beginning of the war, he met an engine designer in California named Lloyd Taylor. And Taylor had a design for a motor that was 4 cylinders, 4-stroke, overhead cam. The first real, production motor that was overhead cam. And he was going to make it out of sheet steel brazed together. So it was going to be called the Cobra because it was going to be brazing together pieces of steel to make the block. That's before welding had really become as practical. So he bought the patent of the thing, and he sold these during World War II to the Defense Department for every kind of genset and every kind of airplane and ground unit you could possibly imagine. Well, after the war, he realized, his brother tried to tell him, the younger brother tried to tell him that this wouldn't last very well. He needed a cast iron block. Well, after the war, they went to a cast iron block. And Paul Crosley wanted to make a car like every other kid of his generation, including Edward. They all wanted to make cars. He decided to make this people's car after the war, the Crosley. It was this engine and a tiny little vehicle that would get 50 miles to the gallon. It did, and it does. And the museum has some. And after the war, he was geared up in Richmond, Indiana to produce these things when the big three were still trying to get over making tanks and bomber engines and stuff. So 46, 47, and 48, Crosley sold tons of these little cars. And people liked them. That's all they could afford. General Motors and Ford, everybody caught up, and they were offering more, and people were willing to spend more. And by 53, his business was defunct. He was spending tons of his own fortune to keep the car company open. So he sold the patents and the engines to an outfit called Armstrong, to a division of General Tire. Anyway, we'll go through the cars first. The guy was a great salesman. He has pictures and everything. And these little engines that can be made to run, as Michael will tell you. He made pickups, ambulances, fire trucks, convertibles, you name it. Anything that he could bolt onto this tiny chassis. And they had mechanical brakes. They didn't have hydraulic brakes. I mean, there were some really severe limitations to the car. And after the war, he sold this to this division of General Tire. And right after it, about 54 or so, twin coach. It was originally the Fagel brothers who built Fagel trucks, or Fagel, some people call them, out in Oakland, California. They moved to Kent, Ohio, and started twin coach, which later became Flexible and all these other kinds of things. There were a lot of twin coaches in Seattle and Detroit. Public transport buses. So anyhow, they got the patent to produce this motor. And the son by this time was in charge. There's a guy named Lou Fagel of Slow Motion 4 hydroplane fame. You may remember the story, the race is happening on Lake Washington, and Lou Fagel has, pretty good experience, but he wasn't racing that day. He was sitting in the stands, and a half an hour before the race starts, the driver of Slow Motion 4 gets sick and can't participate. So the guy that Sayers is his name, I think. The guy that owns the Sayers goes running up in the stands, grabs Lou Fagel, and asks him if he'll drive. He says, sure. He gets up, goes down to Slow Motion 4, starts it up, and wins the race. He's never even seen the boat. He's never been in a ride in a boat, and he wins. So Lou is a real, charismatic and sports type guy. That's him. I have an original ad of this guy framed, this Calvert whiskey. This is him in his helmet with Slow Motion 4 up there in the corner.
I got a question.
Yeah.
There's Fagel engines.
Yes.
That were the little Crosley engine.
Right.
48 cubic inch.
They bought that. Yeah.
Yeah. That's the same Fagel. Right?
Yes. Yes.
Because the later boat, he blew over backwards to see if I was flown by 5.
Yeah. He crashed it.
We bought that boat.
Oh, did you really?
In Seattle.
Oh, yeah. See, it was supposedly in the hospital. He was in the hospital 2 years here. It was supposedly during that recuperation that he envisioned taking this Crosley engine that he had, a 4-stroke, and putting it vertical, and putting a leg on it, and having the first 4-stroke outboard, which he did. The 44.
Fairliner used it. Fairliner boat.
Yeah, and they also
Two of them.
he made a pod drive. The thing would go up 360 degrees in a well, so it would go sideways, and everybody thinks the Japanese did that. He made the first 4-stroke outboard. Everybody thinks the Japanese did it. And he made one of the first successful V drives with that same engine, which was used in Yellow Jacket and some other boats. So anyhow, this is the chronology of the thing. This is from the grandson. But basically, Lou Fagel died of his injuries in '57, and his family sold the rights to the motor and the outboard and everything to a company called Homelight, a division of Textron Corporation, who ran this thing as the Homelight 55. And were pretty successful, but the thing was always heavier than a competing 2-stroke motor, and a lot of boats couldn't handle it. Well, Homelight kept trying. They eventually went to a lighter block and did all these kinds of things. And they offered a Homelight 85. The Homelight 85 was a Lotus sports car engine produced by Coventry Climax in England for about 2 years. And then Homelite got bored with it, and it was bought by Fisher Pierce. The Fisher is the guy that owned Boston Whaler in Massachusetts, and they produced it for a few years, and then it died. But the first 4-stroke outboard motors in the United States were American. They weren't Yamaha, they weren't Honda. But if you ask 9 out of 10 outboard people, oh yeah, this is invented by the Japanese. Invented by the
I
Japanese.
tell you a story about a friend of mine had a Crosby station wagon,
Yeah.
and frame broke on it. So he took it to the garage and drained all the liquid out of it, and rolled it over on a baby mattress, and welded up the frame
Is that right? Yeah.
back in the road.
Yeah, they're cute, and you can pick them up for not a lot of money. You know, a couple of grand, you can buy one, but you wouldn't want to be caught driving one.
Yeah, you know that one car we showed there that had the convertible top to slides all the way back down? They were pulling it up on the stage in LeMay Hall here. The ramps kicked out and the thing stood right on in with the driver in it. Bob, battery Bob was
Is
there.
there?
Yeah, and the engine sat there running like a champ and never missed a beat, man. Stood right back over. We rolled it back over because it was one that Harold gave to the museum.
Oh,
Never hurt a thing.
unbelievable.
Unbelievable, yeah.
Cool.
Those crossovers are cool cars.
Yeah, and this is that's Faggio and one of the hydroplanes. It was Aerojet, a division of General Tire. Couldn't think of their name.
Yeah.
So it went from Crosley to Aerojet, but only briefly, about 2 years. Then Faggio bought it, then Homelite, and then Fisher Pierce.
Ah,
And I've always been fascinated by the progression of the ownership of these motors. So you can trace the Elgins, and Chrysler actually can trace backwards to Kissel Car, you know, building a water witch for Sears Motors catalog in 37. And, you know, all the way through. So I get a big kick out of it. This is the V-Drive. The museum owns one of these now, including the frame. And these bits I just discovered a storage unit in Swim last week.
You get, I get logs of those things, but it sinks the boat.
Yeah, right. The clever thing though is when I went through this bit here is above the water line, there's a plate, shaft goes through, but there's a U-joint here, and the rudder, which is hinged here, the thrust is always directed properly with the rudder because, you know, you move like so. It's a very clever design. So Lou Faggio bought this, and then he made the Outboard, and you know, had a pretty wild-looking cowling on the thing, which never came all the way down to cover the bottom of the motor. If you notice the bottom of the motor here, it only comes down here. He was, I think, worried about cooling by covering it up too much. This is the later cowling, and which is almost just a bit of a 3/4 cowling. And you can look this summer and see if one of those can come across on a Fastenal pallet from Booth Bay Harbor, Maine to here, because I would love for this collection to have one, because they've got the V-Drive, and I'd love them to have an Outboard, and there are 2 in a barn with me. So excited. And also, this, it took 8 years to find that. And the actual remote control, there's one of those here.
is that a cable unit? Okay.
Yeah. And this is the pod drive. This is called VIP, Vertical Inboard Power.
Cool.
Okay, you took this thing and you stood it up, and it had a good seal, and it spun 360 degrees, so you could get the boat could go sideways to the dock. Hence the first pod drive. Everybody thinks that that was invented by Volvo Penta for big boats or something. Well, actually, before that it was in tugboats, but the first application was with Faggio. You know, and it's really clever. I forgot to mention here that when Lou did this motor, the first motor, okay, here's the Crosley motor, straight up and down. And the oil pan is underneath this cowling, straight up and down. So the first problem that he had was, this is a gravity oil system that's pumped back up. You know, it comes down with gravity, it's pumped back up to the head. How do you do that? Well, what he had to do was create a well, a big well here, to hold the oil, the crankcase oil, which gets pumped out of here back up to the motor and it goes down. But the oil pan is still there on the motor. It's really clever. He used a 16 horsepower leg that he bought from Scott Atwater. Scott Atwater used it, but it was a little over too much power for that leg. It wasn't quite heavy enough. So that's another one. There was also, that was a branded Elgin. They actually sold this in a Sears inboard boat, named Elgin, or branded Elgin. And here's the vertical one. This is some of the pulley system. You can see how it spins around. Here's the home light. They punch it out a little bit. It made a 55 horse out of the thing. And many people know this motor, but they don't know where it came from. They don't know its origin. And then that sold to Fisher Pierce. It became the Bearcat 55 and the Bearcat 85. And there's some other nice advertisement in the cutaway. And that's it. Are there any questions? Anybody want to talk about anything? Because this is the end of our
You
presentation.
did good, Larry.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for coming. I didn't think it was very interested in this kind of stuff.
I had to go change the tire on a cart. Broke down there, that's why I was late.
Oh, is that right? Oh, wow. Okay. Not surprising.
Yeah, we heard
Thanks for
that Larry here was jumping.
Oh, by the way, this is all filmed, and this will be available for the docents if anybody, when the motors are hung. It might be a little exciting because I think it's going to look really nice. And, so people want to tell stories.
Oh, we can't wait till we gotta have a story or two.
You got to have stories. That's
Yeah.
why police cars are interesting because of the stories that I'm learning from.
Oh, you got one? I told them, I feel like that two of them last time.
Possibly made by Scott. That's a rare one. They collect your cigarettes. You can still get decals for them, and you can get watering holes.
When you gonna go home?
It's like changing a clutch on a front wheel drive vehicle. You know, it's so much more.
What about you all?
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
It must be the easiest clutch
Must
change.
be damn good. You goddamn finish.
I changed the number of clutches on my dad. It was 52 Chevy. Great hand. Rode the clutch.
Yeah.
So every
Nice
summer,
ride.
I rode the clutch in a 52 Chevy. That was not quite that simple.